questions, you are more than welcome to. Chat and ask any questions, you are more than welcome to. If you're watching this after the fact and mind, and then start off with the thinking. John Locke is like mid to late 1600s. He's kind of like the proto-Enlightenment philosopher, and that's straddling the same time period as people like Newton. Scientific revolution is people questioning trinities, following some connection issues. So, a product of society growing and changing, and as we move after cultural. All right, hopefully that changes things and fixes things. So those are all things that show the idea that people are no longer just content to survive. We're coming out of, and as we learned earlier, we're coming out of the agricultural revolution. And so it's not subsistence farming anymore. We're seeing the accumulation of wealth, the ideas of personal wealth, all that's coming about during the Enlightenment period. We see the physiocrats start to gain hold as they start to question, well, how does mercantilism fit within all of this? And that's kind of where this is going. Again, if you have any questions, let me know in the chat. For the philosophers, we want to know the big ones. We want to know the heavy hitters, and we want to know their big thoughts, especially the political ones. So we want to know, and the order is kind of the way it is on the thing that I gave you. It's Locke, then we move to Montesquieu, then it's kind of Voltaire and Rousseau. These are the names that you have to know. So Montesquieu, you want to think about him setting up kind of what we would think of as a republic, where we have our three branches of government, we have separation of powers. All that is meant to ensure that the monarch doesn't have too much power, to make sure that nobody can have too much power. And that's in part born out of the absolutism of the 1600s. A lot of these peoples we talked about, they're writing from England, and they look at England and they see the constitutionalism within England, or at least they can see across the channel, and they like it. They like the concepts of constitutionalism that England has had as a part of its kind of identity, I guess, for 400 years, 500 years since the Magna Carta was signed, limiting the power of King John. From Montesquieu, move into Voltaire, and Voltaire is all about toleration. And so again, this is flying in the face of absolutism. Absolutism, it's all about the monarch, and that's it. Monarch, what the monarch says goes. But now Voltaire is stepping up and saying, hold on, wait a minute, and looking at how people are treated by the monarch. And that's a big concept here, and that's something that's going to influence the American Revolution, is what is the relationship between the subjects and the monarch? Initially with the American Revolution, people aren't trying to overthrow the king. They're just saying, yo, give us the rights that we deserve as British citizens. England is supposed to be this bastion of constitutionalism. Well, prove it by offering us those same things. Voltaire is very well known in his time. We're getting to a point where political writers are well known in their time frame, and Voltaire's one of them. He's a rock star. As I mentioned multiple times in class, he's communicating with all sorts of people. He's communicating with Catherine the Great. And he and Rousseau, they actually advocate for a monarch. They're not saying get rid of the monarch altogether. That system works in their minds, but what they are saying is that monarch needs to be driven by the Enlightenment. That absolute monarch needs to be able to take complete control and use the ideas of the Enlightenment in order to craft these differences, these changes that need to be made. Your textbook does a nice job of hitting excerpts from some of these people. Let's see. So we'll go through here. Denis Diderot, remember that he is the encyclopedia guy. He's putting this all together. And it starts out as the encyclopedia just being all human knowledge, which is quite an ambitious endeavor. But then from there, it starts to change as he begins to kind of manipulate the narrative. He's anti-institution of the Catholic Church. A lot of these people are deists, remember? And so the idea that there's an invasive Catholic Church doesn't really fit within their worldview. Newton's another one. And so he kind of starts to shift the narrative towards his personal leanings. Your textbook goes through Newton some more. It goes through the latter stages of the Enlightenment, and then it gets to Rousseau. And Rousseau, remember that if Locke and liberal are the first parts of the French Revolution, Rousseau and the general will are the second part, the second large piece of it. Locke's concept, the government is there to ensure that rights are protected, okay, life, liberty, and property. And then when we get to Rousseau, though, Rousseau is a little bit different. He says that the social contract, it's an agreement between the people and the government that the people give up some of their personal freedom and some of their personal identity in order to have the government be completely in charge and protect all of those things. And it's this concept that Robespierre is going to exploit and saying, well, you gave up your freedom in order for us in the Republic of Virtue and the Committee of Public Safety to do what we think is best for everybody, not just for the few. Does Rousseau advocate personal wealth like he does with individual liberty? Yes. I'll be honest with you, I'm not super familiar with his commentary on economics. So I don't really have a great answer to that question. I will tell you that if you change your profile image there, Zach, then you might, do better on the test tomorrow. I'm not saying you will, just, maybe if you're not sporting Chelsea, that would be helpful for you. I don't know from an economic standpoint. I think it is important to look at his stances on society. And so he writes this Emile that's like one of the most widely published. It's like it brings about the period of novelization and widespread novelization. But in terms of economics, I really don't have anything for you there. What is interesting in terms of his commentary on society and families is that's like 50 years from now, he's going to shape some of the family dynamics by saying, oh, hey, maybe we shouldn't dress kids like little adults anymore and they should be, kids. And that's going to eventually be used to impact education in like 50 years. How does Locke ideas tie into the revolution? Think about the beginning part. Remember, who are these people who are running the liberal phase? It's the bourgeoisie. It's the people who have. Yes, they're members of the third estate. They're looking to, in many cases, in some cases, buy their way into the second estate, into venal offices, into land holdings, those kinds of things. Life, liberty, and property. It's not up to the government to simply decide who gets what. It should be, and remember, liberalism, classical liberalism, you want to think about classical capitalism as espoused by Adam Smith in 1776. The idea of laissez-faire economics, the idea of hands-off. The government should not be involved. This goes against the concepts of mercantilism. If you're a friend of the king or the monarch in mercantilism, you get some pretty nice economic perks. But as we move into the liberal phase of the French Rev, it's really like, the government needs to kind of stay out of our business from an economics perspective as well as a little bit of a check on his power from a political perspective. So Locke's ideas drive the beginning part of the revolution because it's classical liberalism. And technically, what we would think of as classical liberalism isn't until the 1800s, but you want to associate Locke with that idea. So I think L. Locke, L. liberal, the idea that the government is not heavily involved, that the government exists to protect the rights of life, liberty, and property, not to determine who has which rights for life, liberty, and property. Everybody has those rights, and the government should not infringe upon them. So the bourgeoisie and Robe tie into Locke. Yeah, I think so. A lot of these groups in the French Revolution, they can look to some of these philosophers and find something that appeals to them. And that lends itself to why these Enlightenment philosophers were read so far and wide. There's a lot to like about them from not just one group. They're not catering just to the lower rung of the third estate or the bourgeoisie of the third estate or the second estate. The clergy, definitely not, I guess. But these other groups, they can find something that they like about them. So yeah, the robe nobility will like Locke. the first part of the revolution, there's a kind of begrudging acceptance of this by many of the parties involved. Yeah, the Second Estate gets their hand gets kind of forced by the National Assembly and by the way things break down there, but ultimately, it's probably not going to change a whole lot for them. The problem comes in when things start to get a little bit hot under the collar and the people of Paris and the sans-culottes start to get involved in the Jacobins. That radical turn, that's what makes everybody step back and say, whoa, like this is getting a little heated in here. You should know Women of the Enlightenment, Mary Wollstonecraft. Next section gets into neoclassicism versus Rococo. Again, think Rococo, think frivolity, and the swing should pop into your head every single time you think of Rococo. It's a really good example. High culture of the 18th century is the next kind of subheading here. I really don't have a ton, except that it's a good indication of the popularization of things coming over from other places. Like, did you hear about the coffee houses are made reference to in here? The ideas of popular culture, of mass popular culture, where people are doing things that they hear other people doing about, and those things start to grow from there. That comes out of it. That's also partially a result of the age of exploration, getting access to new things, new ideas, that kind of drives people. We did talk about Sheza Bakaria, the ideas on justice system and moving the justice system, what we would think of today as progress. World of Medicines, popular culture, elements of towns becoming more and more interested in things that bring them together, carnival, ale houses, those types of things, communal type things, those are coming up there and here. Gets into church-state relations. See, you should probably take a peek at that. I wouldn't go crazy with it, really. You should know John Wesley and you should know Methodism. The development of religion within the Industrial Revolution. That's Methodism is around before that, but that's where it really starts to pop in the Industrial Revolution in England. So I would definitely take a look at that. Then that takes us into chapter 18, European States, International Wars, Social Change. It's nice to look at this section as a reminder that things aren't happening in a vacuum, that things that are happening in France, are happening in Britain especially, are affecting their relations worldwide. We have talked about, we did go into some detail with the changes to the Holy Roman Empire during this time frame, the War of Austrian Succession leading us to the 7 Years' War. You should definitely take a look back at that, I would say. Then it gets into the enlightened absolutists and the concept of whether it actually exists or not. Just some names to know, like you should know some of those names. Any of the social change important right then, or is it mostly tie-ins to later content? I would say it's always important, and when we start to review for the midterm, I'm actually going to have you kids into groups where you're looking at one particular aspect. And so a couple of groups are going to be in charge of social change. Take us social change from the beginning of the year till now. What are some examples that can show us that pendulum? So memorize stuff, no, I would say, but know kind of what is indicative of each time period and what is something that you can look at that would move that pendulum from side to side. It is tie-ins to later content, yeah, but I think it's helpful to have something in mind to say, oh, here's during this time period, here's something concrete that I can point to that is moving the needle in some way. Birth rate patterns, we see the expansion of birth rates. We know the birth rate's really high. Then it gets into the agricultural revolution. We're still kind of in mercantilism, but we're seeing the early pieces of capitalism. Capitalism within nations is coming out here. A lot of focus of chapter 18 in the back end of it is really about society. So I'd say, like Nick, I'd say chapter 18 is going to give you some of that concrete knowledge there. Then we get to the French Revolution, kicks us off with the American Revolution. I think we've hit a ton in the French Revolution over and over and over again. So if you have any questions, let me know. But think phases: liberal, radical, directory, and then probably that's the end of the French Revolution for all intents and purposes. But if you want to think of Napoleon as kind of having his foot in both of the revolution piece and then into the empire phase, I think you probably could. But I like to think of 1799 as the end of it, as he's named for his consul. I think that is really kind of the beginning of the end for him. I'm going to kind of skip over a lot of chapter 19 just because I feel like we hit it so hard. And then with chapter 20, getting through Napoleon here, Grand Empire, the continental system. You absolutely have to know and understand the continental system, if not for the test tomorrow, for the class in general. Industrial Revolution, Legislative Assembly is mostly transition to radical phase. Yes, that's correct, Nick. Legislative Assembly is an indicator of a move towards the radical phase, as people from the initial assembly say, you know what, at the end of this, we're not going to take part in the next step in this process. And that allows, because it's set in Paris now, more radical elements to take control and to kind of guide the narrative of what they're doing from there. So I think that Legislative Assembly, understanding that, is a good understanding of the shift from liberal to radical. Steam engine, cotton industry, transportation, iron industry, the industrial factories, all of those things occurring in England. We've talked about the reason why England really explodes in this era and how England has an advantage. And then it moves into the Low Countries and kind of proto-Germany from there. Again, it's not Germany yet. The importance of India, the loss of the North American colonies for Britain meant that India took on an even greater importance for them. Conflict between England and Ireland is a really good way to look at how England is dealing now with being a regional and international power. Starting to see it, this is a good chapter too. I know we've already hit it with the Age of Exploration, but this is a good spot to look at interaction between European nations and Asia. That's going to play a big role moving forward during the Age of Imperialism. And so the idea that Britain is kind of pseudo-linked up with Japan, and the role that China is going to play in the Age of Imperialism, this is a good spot to take note of where the European nations are with regards to Asia. Working conditions we hit a lot of the efforts to reform. Those are really good. One of the classes today asked, like, which ones should we know? Like, I think we need to know the 10-Hour Act. I think we need to know the Factory Act of 1833. And I think we need to know the Mine Safety Report. Those are things that are looked at as, oh my gosh, these are big pieces and a step towards fighting for workers' rights. We saw the early kind of proto-trade unions developing really prohibitive, but when the Industrial Revolution hits, people start considering trade unions as like a more modern version of guilds. But instead of focusing on the quality of the people within the guild or within the trade union, it's about the trade union's treatment. Because again, you're not working on your own in the Industrial Revolution, you're working for someone. And so we did talk about also how this is the move from land-based wealth to now labor-based wealth. How is wealth accumulated? Is it based on the land or is it based on labor? And so that's the shift that we start to see. And because that's happening in England, that's where we're seeing a lot of these reforms, reform movements start. That's why we're seeing Marx and Engels and their communist buddies get together in London to write the Communist Manifesto. Robert Owen. Robert Owen is, again, a reaction to the conditions and working conditions. And the idea of exploitation is something that he looks at. And he also looks at the morality of the Industrial Revolution. He looks at the morality of where these people are living and kind of the slums that are developing. And he says, you know what, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so his thinking is if everyone can be educated, everyone can have a similar religious philosophy where everybody's engaged with religion. And if everybody is working together in a cooperative environment, then maybe those conditions and things don't happen. So I'm going to start New Lanark and I'm this. So no one person is in charge. It's going to be all of us collectively. And yes, I use that word collective because that's going to come up with Karl Marx, and it's going to come up again with the Russian Revolution and the collectivization of farms. So Robert Owen, the communists actually look at him and say, like, oh, this is like our St. Peter. He's like the next person in line who kind of got us kickstarted and really started this movement forward. They really look back at Owen and consider him to be a big player in the communist ethos, I guess. The Chartist movement, we do want to know the Chartist movement as well. That's just something that I keep touching on. But the idea of these different groups who are starting to try to move towards different reforms, they're just good ideas to have. So I got about like 2 to 3, maybe 5 more minutes here tops. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to fire those out there. I've gone through the majority of what's in your textbook just by kind of hitting some basic concepts and ideas. Hopefully this helps to kind of guide the way that you study for the unit test, but also to guide your understanding. Remember, a lot of this class is about understanding the way that those pendulums swing back and forth, whether it's societal or political or religious or economic or in the art world. All of those things can be used to show shifts. Think cause and effect relationships. Okay, here's the thing that's going on right now. Why is that happening? What is happening around it that would lead us down that path? What's the contextualization of the conditions of that particular time? Yeah, continental system, the idea was to choke off England, but also it's to get these nations in line to ensure that, yes, they are kind of ruling over themselves, but in reality, it's simply a Bonaparte party. Napoleon wants to ensure that he's got everybody rowing in the same direction after he conquers them. And so that's a big piece of why the continental system is instilled. I think the Chartists, for sure. The trade unions, I wouldn't say were advocates of freedom of speech just because I don't know that there's evidence of that. I think maybe if you're going to talk about those two things in the same breath, you need to broaden not freedom of speech, but instead talk about individual personal liberties or something along those lines. Chartists, yeah, I would say, because I think in their literature, they make mention of the concepts of natural rights. Would they then reflect Enlightenment ideas? Yes, question mark. Again, the Chartists, because those Enlightenment philosophers, for the most part, were I guess I should start here. The Chartists, they're not identifying themselves simply in one specific area. They have economic interests, they have social interests, they have political interests, and they push all these things together in their list of like their commandments. Some of that is political in nature. I think you could probably draw a line to some of the Enlightenment philosophers, but it's not like they're just expanding upon Enlightenment ideas. They have their own ideas too. Do they reflect some of these Enlightenment ideas? Sure, like separation of powers, absolutely. I remember the Chartists are in England, and one of the things that they're looking at is political influence of the ancient nobility. Is that something that should still be around? Well, they live in these rotten boroughs, and these rotten boroughs have more MPs. That really doesn't make sense. Why don't the cities where these people are toiling and losing their arms and stuff, why don't they have more say? And the Chartists will actually work to help industrialized workers try to get people who would be advocates for them elected as MPs to represent them in Parliament. All right. If you think of anything else, just shout, and I should be up for a little while at least here, and can help you out there. But I'm going to shut things down via the live stream, and hope you kids please have a good night. Remember that you can't just cram for a test like this. It's more about understanding the way things fit together with some examples. Please make sure you get a good night's sleep, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you. Thanks for checking in, kids. Have a good one.